Meet me on the softer side. Meet me on the softer side. Softer side of your heart.
Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books Author Reading Series. You can find out about this and all of our other author events at www.skylightbooks.com, where you can also browse our inventory as well as order books online. You can also follow us on Twitter or even be our friend at facebook.com. If you'd like to talk to a real person, we can be reached at 323-660-1175. And don't forget, Skylight Books depends on listeners like you to help support us. So whether you're in our neighborhood or browsing online, buy a book or two to help ensure that we'll be around for a long, long time. Thanks and enjoy.
Nicholson Baker, we know, is an amazing writer. We're looking forward to hearing from him. But we also want to thank David Ulin in advance for his fine job. We'll be interviewing Mr. Baker. If you don't know Mr. Ulin's work, just open up the LA Times. He's doing the book reviews, and he's a fine writer himself. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nicholson Baker and David Ulin.
Nice to be here. I love this store. I love the roof of this store, which is Buckminster Fullerene, I guess, or something.
I like the tree.
The tree is incredible. Yeah. Where does it gets? Oh, it gets Skylight. Yes, I understand. Sorry.
All right. So we're going to talk for about half an hour. We're going to open it up to you. There might be some reading. There might be some singing. There might be some other things. We'll see how it goes.
Wax paper and comb.
Wax paper and comb. Ring against a kettle. Right. Ring against a pasta pot. Should we just plunge in?
Yes, please.
Okay. So. Let's start with the obvious question. The new novel, Traveling Sprinkler, is a sequel of sorts to The Anthologist. It picks up the story of Paul Chowder, who is the main character of The Anthologist, the anthologist who couldn't write the introduction to his own anthology. An excellent conundrum. I have been there myself. And so let me ask you, let's start with what was the impetus to return to this character? It's the first time you've gone back to a character in your writing life.
Well, I found that I couldn't say goodbye to him because he actually had a personality. You know, he was in The Anthologist. He was trying to write an introduction, and that's a problem. But as I was writing the book, I felt that he gradually sort of accumulated the way when you move those pieces of cardboard around a cotton candy machine. He began to accumulate a sense of self, a way of speaking, which happened because I wrote the book by setting up a video camera and taping myself trying to explain some of the complexities of rhyme and meter, and I did it so many times that I got bored with what I actually had to say about meter. I first thought, I have a point to make. I want to tell people about the secret sixth syllable in iambic pentameter and all that. By the time I explained it a lot of time into a video camera, it turned out that actually I wanted to talk about other things in life, and that's so the novel just grew out of my own attempt through successive takes, speaking into recording devices and video cameras, sometimes talking while I typing, and this guy Paul, I just gave him a name and he became a person, and I liked him. Okay, he was different enough for me that I could actually have a feeling of affection for him. And then I felt that that it was over. And I wrote a couple other books, and then was in the middle of writing a nonfiction book about trying to write protest songs and trying to rediscover, as a middle-aged man, the music that I'd studied as a high school kid and for a year in college. I was a bassoonist. I had a little moment as a professional bassoonist. I actually bought a tuxedo and I had a white bow tie. I was the fourth bassoonist for the Rochester Philharmonic for a short time. And so I wanted to
How many bassoonists do they usually have on stage?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. Mostly, for Mozart it's 2. For Beethoven it might be 3. So you have to wait for Mahler and Bruckner and these sort of awful late romantic people who need huge numbers of a huge orchestra. And the 4th bassoon is just the person plugging away, playing the notes that nobody hears, and proud to be there, And so sitting up straight, wearing the tux, and the bassoon was incredibly important to me in my youth, and I practiced it so hard that it pushed my 2 front teeth apart, and I had a basketball injury from when a basketball hit me in the jaw. I kind of hurt my jaw, so I had to practice the bassoon with my jaw kind of partly dislocated, so it hurt. But I just kept doing it. So it was really, everything to me was this crazy brown wooden maple wood instrument that had lots of nickel-plated keys. Your thumb controls 12 keys. And then all these years went by, and I always thought, I'm saving up the bassoon. Someday I will write a book that does justice to this incredible Victorian instrument. And then I thought, why have I never even used the word bassoon in anything? I've never done justice to it. And it seemed as if that was a kind of Paul Chowder emotion. Why have I never used the word bassoon in a poem, he says.
Right.
Why have I been avoiding this? This is something that was important. So that's part of what happened with Traveling Sprinkler.
Well, that raises an interesting point, because you say on the one hand that Paul is different enough from you. You guys can all hear me in the back, right? So that Paul is different enough from you to be interesting to you. But at the same time, and you've said this before about him, that there are real similarities between you and Paul. In terms of both sort of inner life and in terms of actually the action that takes place in both of the Paul Chowder novels. I wonder if you can talk about that sort of split, the similarities, and how similar he is, and also what that little edge of distance is.
Well, see, he's, I poured everything I had into this book. So it's a very, very, very autobiographical book. But it starts with some big differences. The big one being that I have never really written, I've only had one published poem. I published a poem in the New Yorker about 20 years ago. And it was really not a poem, it was sort of a trick. It was called From the Index to First Lines. And I thought, it was a Sunday. And I thought, what if you wrote a poem that was made out of a fictional index to a book of poems? You know how when you look and say the H's, they're all the first lines, all the words that begin the first lines, and they all have different metrical systems, and you don't know the poems that they attach to. So I just wrote about 18 first lines to poems that didn't exist, and sent it into the New Yorker, and they published it. And that's my only claim to fame as a poet. Well, Paul Chowder has written 3 books of poems, and he's struggling to write another, I think 2 or 3. And so the huge difference is that he actually understands this world, and I'm sort of a pretender. The other big difference is that I'm a happily married guy who lives in South Berwick, Maine with my wife, and I have 2 grown children, and he is me if I'd never met my wife. That was sort of the key to me, was imagine a person to whom this enormous lucky thing had never happened. I met my wife at Bryn Mawr College. I was at Haverford College, but back then Haverford was all male and Bryn Mawr was all women, and they had an exchange program, and you could live on the Bryn Mawr campus if you were a Haverford student. And so I said, yes, I do want to live on the Bryn Mawr campus. And I lived on this dorm. It was kind of neo-medieval dorm called Rhodes Hall, 3rd floor, and shared a bathroom with all these women. And it was just intoxicating, and I met my wife there and spent the rest of my life with her. What if that had never happened? I would be very like this guy. I would be, pining to find that person. And so that's the huge difference between him and me. And he's maybe, he's maybe a little, no, I'm pretty unhappy. I was going to say he's unhappier than I am, but I have my moods.
Well, he also, I mean, he's fulfilled it, but unfulfilled in the sense that, in the first novel, he's struggling to write this introduction. Mm-hmm. We've talked before about whether or not the novel itself is, in fact, the introduction that he can't write, or sort of long version of the introduction, almost a Nabokovian idea, right? The introduction is longer than the book itself. But and in this book, he's not writing. I mean, he has got this book of poems that he's supposed to be writing. He has some conversations with his editor periodically who wants to know how the book is going. He sort of tells him the book's going better than it is.
Which you do with an editor.
Right.
It's going well,
We'll have it very soon. But he isn't writing. I mean, in a way, he likes to think about the poems that he wants to write, but he is not actually putting anything on paper.
Well, what he's doing is experimenting with tobacco. So he says to his editor, I've got a title, because there's a poem that I've written called Misery Hat. And this is a subject that's attracted me periodically, is this idea that you have something that you knit for yourself that has a supernatural power, this yarn that you have. You wander into a yarn store, they're beautiful. There's nothing more beautiful than a yarn store. And you pick a skein of some kind of yarn that has all sort of secret threads in it, and it turns out to be a magical yarn, and you knit it, and when you knit this cap, maybe it's one of those caps with the things coming down or something, and you put it on, it turns out to be a misery hat, a hat that allows you to feel all the sad things that are happening within a certain radius. Maybe it's 50 miles, or maybe it's 5,000 miles. And so he writes a poem called Misery Hat, and then he thinks, no. And somebody, a famous, semi-famous editor at The Atlantic, rejects his poem, Peter Davison. Peter Davison, I rejected my first novel, so there's how the fiction and nonfiction intersect. But he says, it's not just going to be a poem in this book. I'm going to call it Misery Hat. And he says to the editor, I've got a title. And he said, and the editor says, I just don't think that, Misery Hat is a selling kind of, and that's true. And so, what do you do when you have to finish something and you don't want to finish it and you need a new drug? What I did was to buy some chewing tobacco, those little round cans, Skoal. I thought, why not? People do this, and so I bought. I bought it. I kind of cut it. Well, I watched a lot of YouTube videos.
You had no experience with tobacco before.
No. And the idea of smoking a cigarette is disgusting, But I slapped the can against my hand the way they did it in the videos and cut it around. Then took this enormous, mass and stuffed it in my mouth. It's called a hammer. I got a hammer in my mouth, this kind of huge wad of this disgusting material, and I'm starting to, salivate madly. And in real tobacco chewers have this thing called a mud jug, which I had to write about in the book because they're so fascinating. Mud jugs, different kind of Confederate flag mud jugs, horrible, sort of a rednecky thing. So I actually just sort of semi-lost consciousness. And I just, spit out this hammer load of horrible tobacco and just lay on the grass thinking, oh my God, I'm dying. So I then tried, that did not work. That did not help me finish my novel. But there's hope, because it obviously had a mental effect. So then I got a pipe. My grandfather smoked a pipe, and I thought, and Alan Dulles, head of the CIA, smoked a pipe. So I bought a pipe and smoked it, and that was a lot of work, stuffing things in and everything. And in the end, I went into a cigar store, which I'd never been in, and it's a really fascinating place, and it has a closed area, a sort of columbarium of cigars. It's a closed place. You open it and get in there, and it's quiet, and the cigars are all resting, and they're waiting, and it's very like a bookstore. It's just, and they all have beautiful labels, and I said to the guy, give me a cigar that will help me finish my book. I need something really powerful because I've got to finish this book. And he said, do you want something robust? And I said, I'm not just robust. I want something that just kicks me in the head and wipes the floor with me, takes me down. And he said, you want a Fausto? A Fausto. I said, yes, I want a Fausto. And he took me over to this box, and it had these red labels, and I bought 5 of them, and I smoked them, and I was off. I was writing like a demon after that.
So there,
sitting in the car.
Right. Smoking cigars and writing. There you have it, the key to successful novel construction. So, I mean, you talked earlier that you were working on a book, a nonfiction book, that you were finding yourself unable to write, and that this sort of came out of that. There are elements of music, or I mean, many elements of music, but elements of that book come out in this book.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of Paul talking about his youthful musical interest and musical achievement, in terms of all the writing about Claude Debussy. And was Debussy part of the original book, the nonfiction book you were writing?
Right. The original book was going to be a book that was going to write about unhappy things like drone warfare, but I thought, don't just give them this word drones that everybody hears and thinks, oh God, not another book about drones. Give them something beautiful. So it was going to be sort of a guy shuttling back and forth between Claude Debussy's 10th Prelude, The Sunken Cathedral, and drone warfare. And it just didn't, it felt false, it didn't actually feel, what you want from a memoir is for it to be true, and it didn't feel true. And the nice thing about writing novels is that if you construct a person who is a little bit unlike you, you can really actually pour yourself into it and be more truthful that way. So in the end, I think I got more of myself out into this book, even though it's technically a novel, because lots of it isn't absolutely true, than I would if I had tried to tell it exactly as it happened. But in a given day, I would try to write a piece of music using some music writing software. Apple's Logic Pro was what I was using, and a keyboard. And sometimes I would record things around the house. Like I had well, you mentioned the pasta pot, but I recorded my wedding ring against the pasta pot with some water in it because it got a kind of warped feeling, and I used that as a rhythmic motive in one song. And then I discovered the hard-boiled egg slicer, which that it's sort of like a harp. It's got 6 strings, and you plink it, and it formed a scale. So I recorded all the notes in the scale and mapped them to the keyboard, and then I could actually play a little something that was. I was playing the tune of the hard-boiled egg slicer, and that's appealing to me because that's what I think that novelists are doing, is you look around the room and you think, what are the interesting pieces of our life and how can we sing them? Well, in this case, I could actually use it as a musical element in a song. So I would try to write a song, and then I would read a little Medea Benjamin on drone warfare, and somehow mixed it all together.
Well, they all appear in the book. Medea Benjamin is referenced in the book.
Sure.
There's a lot of Paul reflecting on drone warfare, and then the music, which is in the first book, Paul spends a lot of time, as you mentioned, reflecting on meter and poetry. I often think of the Anthologist as the first novel ever written about iambic pentameter. And in this novel, he makes music. I mean, one of the things that he does to sort of deal with the fact that he can't write his book is to make music. How did that come in? Did you start making the music first and then sort of work it into the book? Did they kind of evolve simultaneously? What was that relationship? How did
it was back and forth. I started by writing the music, and then when I was still in the nonfiction realm, and then abandoned that, and then so increasingly wrote the songs in the voice of Paul Chowder, which means I wrote the best songs I could possibly write given my own limitations. But it was a book that evolved. I guess I thought of it evolving the way it would, if you know, the title of the book, Traveling Sprinkler, is sort of what the way it felt like to write the book. A traveling sprinkler is a little cast iron tractor. Do you know what a traveling sprinkler is? I mean, it's a beautiful, it's the great American machine. It is. I went to Sears with my dad when I was about 7, and we were in the gardening supply place, and Sears was putting its brand name on everything, but it was made by this company called National Sprinkler in North Platte, Nebraska. Anyway, it's a green and white tractor made of cast iron, and you screw the hose in the back, and the water comes up and twirls out the helicopter twirly element, and that is nice because it would water the garden, but that's like a normal sprinkler. But this was a traveling sprinkler, which meant that it also turned this central gear, and these things called pawls, Pawls, like the Eberhard poem about the belt feed holding pawl, the Second World War poem. But this little pawl would hook one of the white teeth of the rear tractor wheels of this thing and make a little clinking sound and pull it forward as the thing was going down around in 16th notes, and then the thing would go clink, and then it would pull this machine forward by 1.5 inches, you know, and then clink. And it was just this tortoise-like progression of a machine slowly pushing, wanting to go further around whatever it is you had to sprinkle. And that was good, but it wasn't all, because it was also that the front wheel, this little atrophied front wheel of the traveling sprinkler, I thought of it as, you know, the Tyrannosaurus Rex has those kind of tiny little front arms, but it has this little white wheel, and you put it over the hose. So the hose, which is the source of its motive power, its history, its past, you run the hose all over your garden, assuming that you don't give it too sharp a turn, and then you put the traveling sprinkler on that thing, and it follows it around. It actually follows its own history. It's sort of a double thing. There's this terrible moment where universes will collide in a kind of science fiction-y way when the traveling sprinkler makes it all the way back to the faucet, you know. So that idea of just sort of feeling my way through songwriting, you know, he's in love with this fantastic woman who doesn't, for some reason, has taken up with a muckraking doctor. All those different things in his life, he has to kind of arrange the flow of his own rationalization around. So that's...
Well, it's funny. I mean, the novel works like a traveling sprinkler, as you suggest, in a way, because it is Paul sort of traversing his own history and thinking back, trying to go back, trying to reconcile certain things. It's a novel of middle age. He's 55. Mm-hmm. He talks about how Debussy died at 55. Mm-hmm. There's that one riff where he talks about, you know, when he was 55, Dylan Thomas had been dead for 17 years, and Keats had been dead for almost 30 years. And there is this constant kind of comparison, right? What have I done? Look at these people. What have I done? Where am I going? Mm-hmm. What's going on? I mean, the book is sort of imbued with that sense of time's limitations in a way. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, I remember when I was about 23, I took a writing class with Donald Barthelme at Berkeley. And he was a very kind of a brusque man, brilliant writer, very funny on the page, but kind of brusque in person. But he said this one thing that I really always remembered. He said that when you pass the age of 50, you start counting, you know, and it's true, and it's frightening. I'm constantly doing little arithmetical exercises where I say, well, I'm 56, so let's say 65 minus 56. So, I'm always, then I kind of extend the farther end of it a little bit to, so I think what you want to do is try to be true to the fact that time is limited. And I feel more pressure to say whatever it is that I have left to say in some kind of coherent way. And it's hard to finish things. And I have lots of unfinished projects. I never go into my office because my office is sort of a boulevard of broken dreams of all these horrible stacks of things that I didn't finish. So that's why I always write all over the house. I write in the yard, I write at the kitchen table, I write in the barn, because I never want to see all the things that I've failed to finish. But at some point, you have to finish those things,
Do you think that's the most important thing for a writer is finishing, or for any artist, right? Is to finish for good or ill. You're not going to, you do what you can, but eventually you want to finish.
I think that something amazing happens when you've finished a story or finished a novel is you get to look at it. It becomes a thing. It's suddenly out there and it's sort of floating, and you can look at it in all of it. You can turn it in various directions and say, what does it lack? Is it good? Is it bad? Where do I need to work on it? If it's always in process, you're just putting something off. You're just, in some ways, you're just wasting your time. And I have all of the traveling sprinkler file. I have. It's probably 10 years old. I have all the old patents. I have the 1938 patent for the traveling sprinkler and the 1941 patent by a man named Wilson for the traveling sprinkler. And it all gets older, and it starts to be this manila folder that's just not doing anything. It's just sitting in a pile. And sometimes you think, okay, I'll go through it and put some Post-it notes in it, But unless you take that thing and simmer it, and make some sort of a balsamic sauce out of it that turns into something finished, you don't take the next step.
What I've always admired about your fiction, going back to the Mezzanine, is the idea of this sort of, the important life is the inner life. If you look at a book like The Mezzanine, narratively, it's, the narrative action is a guy on his lunch hour buying shoelaces, having a sandwich. Room temperature, similarly. And the Anthologist or Traveling Sprinkler sort of fall into that category, too. There's not a lot of narrative bells and whistles. The real movement takes place in terms of the character's reflections. I'm curious about your sense of the novel as a form that can encompass all of that. It feels like you're really consciously or otherwise kind of blurring lines in the sense of lines between fiction and essay. There's as we've been talking about a little bit, there's an essayistic quality to a lot of this, but that idea of a kind of mind in contemplation as the center of a work of fiction.
Well, I do like the idea that a novel can offer you tips and tricks, helpful little things. Why not? I mean, why can't it help you? And the Mezzanine, I had come up with this way of putting on deodorant by sort of sneaking the deodorant up the pleural cavity between the T-shirt and shirt, hooking and doing it. And I thought, describe that, help people out, and that, I guess that's essayistic, but I just think of it as being, constructive. These are the problems that life offers. Novels are supposed to be part of the way we are helped to understand life. I hope that I've taken little steps after the Mezzanine, Room Temperature, and A Box of Matches, very, very enclosed books. In Traveling Sprinkler, this hero does have to contend with some somewhat bigger things. The woman that he wants to get back together with, turns out to have. This is the first love story that involves a hysterectomy, right? That's a big thing. For somebody like Paul, that is a monumental, that just, blows a hole in his life that he has to deal with something like that. And so I'm hoping that my range is extending slightly. But I think the novel has to accept the fact that we are people who learn about the big things in life mostly by reading the paper. Mostly we're very lucky people. Very few violent things happen to us. We live in the United States, but we read about things that happen in other countries that upset us, and that kind of percussion of event also is part of our life. And we see things on YouTube that's part of what flows in. And I think a novel that filters out that kind of reality is a novel that's falsifying the way we think about life.
Did you, I think that comes across, I think, in the way that the political elements of the novel operate. Paul's concern about the drone warfare, the riff on Medea Benjamin, his friend who is writing a book about activism. It makes its point without that point overwhelming the story. Were you at all given pause by the question of weaving political, there is sort of
yes.
that homily against political fiction, right? Don't write political fiction.
Right.
It gets in the way of your story. Did that give you pause at all at any point?
It gave me pause, but then I thought, for one thing, I love doing research, so I have spent many happy days at the National Archives and at the Library of Congress going through old memos, carbons, the feeling of old carbons from the 40s and 50s, old rusted staples, things that nobody has read. Because I've gone through that stuff, I've learned things that I think of as either unknown or underknown. And one of them was that was salient to this book because it's about poetry, both books, which was that Archibald MacLeish, three-time Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and playwright, was in effect sort of the godfather of the Central Intelligence Agency. Think of that. Back in 1941, in the summer of 1941, he was the Librarian of Congress, and he had Roosevelt's ear, and he was sort of the bright young man on the scene. He was writing speeches for Roosevelt. Roosevelt said, I want you and William Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, to get together, and I want you to form a Bureau of Secret Things. And they met.
That's what they should have called it.
That would have been a good. They met. He says there's a letter that I've read where Archibald MacLeish says, "Don't you remember?" This is several years later. Remember, Bill, that wonderful time when we sat on that cool porch, imagining the great things that were to come. What were the great things? It was the Office of Strategic Services. That was the secret bureau during the Second World War. But what MacLeish wanted to call it. And there's this big fat document in the Library of Congress that's called Proposal for a Central Intelligence Service in the Library of Congress and the relationship of the Library of Congress thereto. And it spells out the way the Library of Congress would assemble and manipulate and cook information, make sense of things to help the war effort. So MacLeish became, in a sense, the namer of the Central Intelligence Agency, and some of his skull and bones proteges, like James Jesus Angleton and Cord Meyer, became the paranoid nutcases that then ran the Central Intelligence Agency in the big go-go days of the 50s. So I had this little bit of research that has been, struggling to get out in me all these years, and I just stuffed it in there. It only takes 3 paragraphs.
Do you want to read something from the book?
Okay, sure. Thank you. So, the traveling sprinkler is a metaphor, and it brings up this problem for Paul Chowder of it's the problem of metaphorical interference. It's a serious problem, at least for me. What is metaphorical interference? Okay, well, it's when 2 or more strong metaphors are podcasting in the same room together, and they mess with each other. They mix, but not necessarily in the very same sentence the way a classic mixed metaphor mixes. They mix structurally. Say, for example, that you've decided to mention the traveling sprinkler in your poem. The moment you mention it, it starts to twirl and hiss and spray water everywhere. It becomes a controlling metaphor. There's no help for it. You're going to get wet. But then, say the traveling sprinkler seems to be tightly connected in your mind, perhaps by a long pale green hose, to another idea that interests you, which is Debussy's piano prelude, The Sunken Cathedral, the 10th prelude. You know, it's this amazing work in C major, a key that Debussy didn't use. It is this evocation of a secret ruined structure that's just sort of shimmering. C major is all white keys, right? But if you pile up the white keys, the water becomes kind of bluish and the cathedral is in the distance. You think you're still all right because one, the traveling sprinkler, is a real object, and the other is a piece of classical music that contains a metaphor of submergence. But then you remember that some yellow jackets have made their nest in the hollow plastic of the hose reel. This happens to me every summer. I know that if Nan, my next-door neighbor, says that I can set up the sprinkler's hose route around her tomatoes, I'm going to need my hose as well as her hose. And I know that as soon as I start wheeling the hose reel around and pulling the hose off it, the yellow jackets are going to fly out and dart at me angrily and sting me as I run away. I don't want to be stung, so I'll debate whether I should boil up a pasta pot of water and pour it on the hose reel handle, destroying the yellow jacket nest. My friend Tim told me about this technique, and it definitely worked. But when I did it, I felt horrible afterward. What right did I have to destroy a whole happy nest of insects, regardless of how annoying they are when they crawl around on the potato chips? Now your poem is in trouble. You've got wasps in the hose reel, you've got the sprinkler twirling at the end of the hose, and you've got Debussy's cathedral sunk under the waves. You've got fish, you've got tomatoes. You're starting to get strange purple interference patterns, fringe moire patterns at the edges of each metaphor where it overlaps its neighbor. Photographers call this purple fringing, and it's a flaw. This is the moment when your creative writing teacher may say, "You've got an awful lot going on here, Paul. Maybe you need to pare this poem down and pick a controlling image." And you acknowledge that he has a point. Too many colors make the rinse water muddy. We know that. On the other hand, the world is full of metaphors that are happily coexisting in our brains, and we don't go crazy. You have them all swarming and nesting and reeled up in there, but they don't trouble one another. One moment you entertain one metaphor, and the next moment the next, no harm done. And this time you think, I don't want to worry about this rhetorical non-problem. I want to pour them all in and let them go wild together. Let all the metaphors fuck each other like desperate spouse swappers. I don't care. I summarily reject this notion of metaphorical interference for the time being, and I'm putting it aside, and I'm going to think over the things that call forth thought, and if they happen to get in one another's way from time to time, that's just what happens. So that was my method in writing the book. Thank you.
So I just want to ask you a couple more questions,
Sure.
and then we'll turn it over.
Yeah.
But I do want to ask you, you also say in the book that poems shouldn't be long, that a poem shouldn't be longer than 2 pages, or Paul says in the book,
Yeah.
I should say.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I mean, that is your method in terms of writing the book. Is that, I mean, that's something you can do in a novel. You can have a whole lot of things going on, whereas perhaps in a poem you feel that you can't, or is that simply the conceit that you're using for the purpose of the book?
I've never used any, crafty conceit for anything. I'm always totally sincere. But what I like about books of poems and why they taught me how to write prose is that you're always beginning on any page, practically. Unless sometimes they bleed onto the second page. But if it's a book of lyric poems from, say, Howard Moss, Stanley Kunitz, Elizabeth Bishop, they're usually a page and a half. You're always starting out. I love that. And the thing that I like best about novels, actually, is that big white stretch of emptiness where it says chapter 1. And then there are a couple words in small caps, and I'm very happy at that point. Sometimes I peter out after that, but so I like things. I am impatient. I like things to happen in small chunks because I think that most of the time when we're thinking our way through life, the cycles of thought we have are about a paragraph and a half, 2-3 paragraphs long. We seldom think in full chapters.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you a little bit about Debussy, who I knew very little about until I read this book. So I hope it's accurate. But I want to ask you about sort of the appeal of him and the draw of him, both to you and to Paul. The sense of his career. This idea that he produced this beautiful piece of music at the end of his life when he was struggling for money, struggling with health issues, struggling with a sense of being defeated almost, or that life had kind of turned out in a way that he hadn't anticipated or desired. All those are really resonant ideas. I think they speak not just to Paul, but they speak in general. They certainly speak to human experience. So I just want to ask you to talk a little bit about that.
Well, okay, Paul Debussy, somebody said he looked like a banker. He had a comb over. He had an enormous forehead, which is where the music lived. And when he was a young kid at the Conservatoire, he could just noodle endlessly. And everybody would sort of cluster around the grand piano. Debussy is playing. And then all these chords would just, nobody had heard the sounds that he was making before. And he was really a prodigious engine of originality in the history of music. But you have to make a living. And he smoked a lot, smoked way too much, and he collected little tiny carved jade toads. He had very expensive tastes, and he married the wrong woman, and she ended up trying to shoot herself with a handgun, but survived. Married another woman, thought he was going to be rich because she was rich, but her father disinherited him. He's 55, he's got cancer of the down below, and he's, he realizes that it's now or never. And he writes these 12 preludes. A prelude just means you can go anywhere you want. You start and you just go. And and each one of them is different. And they have a number at the top. And the interesting thing about them is that they just say 10 or 9 or 8 at the top in Roman numerals. You don't know what the prelude is about till you've played your way through it and you come to a little italicized title at the end. It's very, secret. Secretly it's about the sunken cathedral, but it's really about a piece of music. So the man is just... Debussy appealed to me because when I was at the Eastman School of Music as a bassoonist and would-be composer, I went into their stacks and pulled out Debussy's preludes and put the big LP down on the thing and set the tone arm down and had my big Life Raft headphones on, and it was an incredible experience to hear somebody that original just doing things. You can actually hear Debussy himself playing on a player piano roll performance, and it's my favorite piece of classical music. And it just seemed, because it was so important to me, I thought that I wanted to give it a position of prominence. I wanted to think about what it was like to be somebody who was very aware of his own mortality and who had to support himself as a conductor. He was the worst conductor in the world, very wooden conductor. But he had to go to England, to Germany, even to Russia, and sort of make a living as a conductor because they wanted to see him. He just fascinates me, and I wanted to give his piece of music a big moment. I wanted to give it a novel. And one of the things that Paul Chowder does towards the end of the book is he thinks, God damn it, I'm going to drive to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, because that's the place in the United States where the Sunken Cathedral was first performed, at the Casino Building in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. I want to see that building. So he gets, so that, and it's helpful to me because, as you know, I'm always starved for incident in my books. And so the fact that he has to drive to Stockbridge was very helpful.
All right, let's, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And let's turn it over. We should also point out that the music that was playing before is music that Nicholson Baker made as part of the process of writing the book and is available as part of the ebook. Is that right? Is there a...
Yeah, if you buy the ebook, you get, there are two ebook versions. Well, there's the normal ebook and then there's the so-called deluxe ebook. And the deluxe ebook has an album at the back that says, says Traveling Sprinkler, an album, and it has 12 songs in it. It has a protest song that I struggled with, and I set I set 4 lines of Gerard Manley Hopkins, long live the weeds in the wilderness yet, a beautiful poem. I just did the best I could with the musical talent that I had and tried to write in the voice of Paul Chowder, but also just had a lot of fun plinking around on the keyboard.
So we'll take some questions if anyone wants to raise their hand.
So in the book there's a link to a YouTube video and he talks about some other specific YouTube videos that we went and found, and I was just wondering if you contacted these people and asked like, hey, can I put you in my book, or if it's just going to be a surprise for them?
The question is, okay, so I did a sort of postmodern thing that I seemed exciting at the time and was probably a mistake, which was that there's a very nice scene in which a Canadian singer-songwriter named Stephen Fearing is filmed, just casually filmed in a Paris hotel lobby singing a song. I don't want to know about evil, I just want to know about love. And he just sings the hell out of this thing, and he's got a slide guitarist with him, and somebody put it up on YouTube, and it's beautiful. And that is just the same impulse as I thought I would really like people to see this thing. And then I got excited about the idea that I would not, that it's a printed work. So if you type out a YouTube link in this thing, and you tap on it, or you're not going to go anywhere. But you're going to look at that long URL, And I love looking at those. It's got the backslash and the question mark, watch, question mark, and then it goes capital H, J, K, and capital J, 6, 5, It's a long thing of gobbledygook. And yet, this magical thing that we don't understand takes us to a Paris hotel lobby. So, no, I didn't ask permission. Why should I ask permission? This nice person posted it on YouTube. It's part of the flora and fauna of our life, just the way it would be if I was writing about the botanical gardens or about Wilshire Boulevard. YouTube is part of the terrain that we deal with every day.
More questions? Other hands?
If I quoted from it, that's a different thing. If you actually use somebody else's words without permission, that's, I think, an infraction. But yes, sorry.
Don't be shy. We'll start calling on people.
It's the hardest thing in the world to ask questions, I think.
You talked a little bit about the struggle to write about politics, and I wanted to ask a little bit more about what was the hardest aspect for them about this stuff.
Well, okay, that is what is so hard about writing about politics? Well, one thing you just feel as if you're chiming in. You feel you're whining. You feel you're saying what everybody's saying. Glenn Greenwald is saying it, and he's really smart, and he's saying it better than I'm saying it. And he's on the case, and he's making news, and he's got the links. And all I'm doing is saying, yeah, Glenn Greenwald is right. That's not very good. Also, my mother is a tremendous Obama supporter, and I wrote this all during the campaign. There's sort of mentions of the campaign, and I didn't want to break her heart by saying, God damn it, this man who put hope all over those damn posters, then quintupled the number of drone strikes and destroyed all of the good feelings that we had. And there's a sort of, just a terrible distress in having good intentions and hopes just simply steamrolled over that way. So there's some anti-Obama things that just had to kind of sneak out. Just let it out. I mean, it was a disaster, and nobody was able to say how bad a disaster it was because we all wanted it to work out so well. And it's just heartbreaking. So the hardest thing for me was to actually just think, well, tell the frickin' truth, He broke our hearts. He did the wrong stuff. Over and over again, he made the wrong decision. He's been a disaster, much worse disaster than any, simple-minded Republican, because we believed that he was capable of better things. And that's why I have to rein myself in by inventing a fictional character and only confining him to several paragraphs at a time about that. There's too much politics in the novel, even the little tiny doses. I mean, it's like a hypodermic needle. You jab it in once and pull out, and it's so much even to put a tiny bit in there. That's the other hard part. And also the words are so familiar. A word like Brennan, oh my God, Brennan. It's a fatiguing word to read it on the page. I much rather read the name of the Secretary of Defense or the head of the CIA in the 50s. Let's say I'd rather read about Allen Dulles and his pipe than I'd like to read about any current political figure. I'm always interested in things that are a little out of the way. So that was the other challenge about writing about current politics. That's a very good question. Yes?
Why did you choose to write your name in lower caps? I'm just curious.
Why would I choose to write my name in lower caps? Because there was a very good designer at Penguin Books who put my name in lower caps. I mean, and
it's in full caps on the spine.
Okay, it's in full caps on the spine. I picked this picture of the hose I found, but I like the way the hose kind of intersects with the typography. But I have been really fortunate in book jackets in that talented people take the title and kind of play around with it and come up with images that I don't have anything to do with. This is the first one that I actually had some contribution to because I chose the hose picture. So I'm really pleased about that.
You wrote a whole book about being a big fan of John Updike's writing.
Mm-hmm.
When he passed away several years ago, did you go through a mourning process? Did you celebrate his life by returning to his books, or?
So I wrote a book called You and I, which was my little adventure in what I thought was something like memory criticism. How do you write about a writer if you do not prepare to write about him? You don't say, okay, I'm going to write a book about Updike and I'm going to read all of Updike. No, I'm going to write a book about Updike without actually doing any studying. I'm just going to write about it with only the phrases that are in my mind now. So it was a short book. But so once I'd finished that, I actually was embarrassed because for one thing, Updike would go to readings and people would come up and say, what do you think about that Nicholson Baker book about you? And I felt that I was sort of dogging him, that I was, following him around, and it was embarrassing. But I then had this stately correspondence with him, and he never wanted to really sit down and have a cup of coffee, but he was perfectly happy to write me a postcard from time to time. And then, I think because I'd written a whole book, I sort of didn't read him as attentively, which is a terrible thing to say. And then he died. And I was stunned because, of course, one imagines, I don't understand death. One imagines that everybody is going to live forever in a way. And what I've found recently, several years after he's gone, is that I've rediscovered that he is one heck of a good essayist. And I've been reading, I start the morning sometimes just reading one of his book reviews about anything, about the Titanic and the Lusitania, or about some neglected Eastern European writer. And he turns out to be just a tremendously amazing positioner of adjectives and fashioner of sentences. And so all of my old complexities of admiration and rivalry and everything else have just disintegrated, and now I just think I am really learning a lot from this human being, and he's still alive, you know.
I really loved all the descriptions in the book of the Quaker meetings.
Oh yeah.
I've always kind of been fascinated by Quakers, but are you a Quaker? Or is that
So the question is, am I a Quaker? There are lots of descriptions of Quaker meetings in this book. My mother's family, my grandfather was raised a Quaker. He lived in Moorestown, Pennsylvania, on a street with all his Quaker relatives in a big house, and he didn't turn out to be a good Quaker. He drank way too much, and he liked Renaissance art. He became an art historian, and the Quakers were sort of opposed to music and art, or some of them. So my mother was raised in a sort of Quakerish ambiance, and I never really understood what that meant. But then I happened to go to a Quaker college, Haverford College, and the one Quaker meeting I went to was on graduation day, and it was quite amazing. Everybody was sitting still and just being quiet, and I liked it. And then I just sort of forgot about it. I'm not a religious person. I don't want to say I'm an atheist because that's such a brutal word. I'm a non-theistic person. Hitchens takes it so far, and he's so rough, he's so nasty about it. But so then my wife and my daughter went to the Dover Friends meeting, which is just a few miles from where we live in Maine. And they came back saying, my God, it was amazing. It was silent. And then this woman stood up and talked about two rocks in a creek side by side. And she said this beautiful thing, and everyone was choking up. And I thought, I want to have what she's having, and so I started to go to this same meeting. And I found that it was it's very hard to describe, but it's called expectant waiting. But you just sit in the silence with other people who are doing their best to be good people, but silent. And the dragster tires of your mind start kind of spinning, and smoke is rising, but you can't say anything. And then sometimes you feel, God, no, I have to say something. I have to stand up. And there's this almost physical thing of just standing up and telling people whatever it is. In this case, Paul pops up and wants to tell them about Debussy's Sunken Cathedral, of course, and then doesn't. And that's the great moment of self-renunciation, is that you don't say what you've spent all meeting trying to say. But it's just a tremendous place to think about how you could possibly be a better person with all these other people who are thinking the same thing. And sometimes somebody says some broken, fragmentary thing, and you can just sort of feel it bounce around the meeting house. And I always have a lot to write about afterwards. So it's just been a tremendous help to me as a writer to go to these meetings and just sit still. The whole etiquette, it's like Excelsior. Somebody says something, and you can't then just stand up and say something immediately afterward, because that's rude. You have to allow the silence to kind of puff around it and insulate it, and then something else happens. So sometimes there's only, say, 2 things said in a whole hour. And these are all very chatty people, because after meeting, it's just a pandemonium of chat. But during it, it's just still. The only thing that's happening is that darn clock is going. And then when it runs out, sometimes the wound-up clock runs out, and Oh my God. The clerk of the meeting sort of scampers open, winds it up, and it starts clicking again. Yes, sorry.
I was just going to ask you how you knew when a Quaker meeting was over, if nobody says anything, but there is.
The way the meeting ends, it's probably different for every meeting, and there are two kinds of Quakerism. There's programmed worship, which is I don't know anything about. It's sort of like regular church where people sing and do stuff. And then there's Quaker meeting, which is unprogrammed, where you don't have to do anything at all except sit quietly. Well, so I'm always watching the clock. At 11:29, 11:30, about 11:31, the clerk of the meeting just turns to the person next and shakes hands. And that means it's over. And then everyone shakes hands, and then it's done. And you will not be the same person if you go to one of these things and sit through it. It'll be good. You'll enjoy it.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, do you know when you're writing a book, do you know how it's going to end when you're writing it before you write it?
Do I know how a book is going to end? Well, I like happy endings. I can't stand when people think that they're being, dark by having things end all broken and wrecked and sad. So I know it's going to be happy somehow. But how to get there? In this case, I knew that there was this whole crisis of a health crisis that he had to deal with. So I kind of knew that was waiting in the wings. I'll tell you what happens is when you get about 3/4 of the way through a book, and this has happened with every book, 15 of these little books, I get this desperate urge to finish, and it's just so powerful that I push really hard to get finished. It's a high, actually, to get done with the book. It's eagerness to get finished. So in some ways I just so much want to finish that I don't know how it's going to end. I just sort of rush through.
We got time for one or two more? Sure.
Yeah, I read your book, The Everlasting Story of Nori, when it first came out.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you actually had a young daughter like the narrator of the book did, but if you did, she must be out of college by now.
Mm-hmm.
She want to be a writer.
God, you know so much. Questions about Everlasting Story of Nori. It's about a 9-year-old girl in a town in England. It's based on a year that I spent with my family in England, in Ely, which has a beautiful cathedral. And my daughter was 9, and I would take her to school in the morning, and she would go to school and learn how to use a medium nib pen, or whatever it was that they taught in England. They were very good teachers there. And then I would pick her up from school and I'd say, would you like to be interviewed? And so I basically interviewed her about every day of school. And then it was an enormous transcription. And then I fictionalized things and played with things a little bit. And it's always bothered me because I feel that I sort of appropriated her 9-year-old life. And I've talked to her about it. She's 26 now. And she does want to be a writer. And I think I wrote about that stuff that she would be writing about now, and it's maybe a mistake, but she says, no, I would never have remembered some of those things if you hadn't interviewed me then. So I guess it sort of worked out okay.
One last question. Any takers?
I should ask a more sensible question the first time. I guess as an outstanding member of the Antiquarian Society, and I guess as a lecturer at the Cambridge Society, what is it like at the Cambridge Union Society?
What is what like at the Cambridge Union Society?
Lecture there.
I've been to Cambridge, but I've never lectured at the Cambridge Union Society, but I sure would love an invitation. I mean, I love the way they mow the lawns in Cambridge. That kind of crisscrossing thing and the beautiful, the kemptness of everything there. But I've lately just, I don't know, I guess my Anglophilia has taken a hit. The British Empire did terrible things. What can I say? But no, if I got a call from the Cambridge Union Society, I would happily lecture there about something. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, David.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget that you can check out this and all of our other great podcasts at www.skylightbooks.com. Today's music was provided by Fragile Gang. You can check them out at MySpace, Facebook, and the iTunes Music Store. Thanks for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.